Come back to our series of messages through Ezra, restoring hope, recharging your faith, from Ezra chapter 4 and chapter 5. One thing that I often battle is falling into lethargy when it comes to the church and it comes to my faith. You know, it can be so easy to just settle for, well, that's okay, or that's pretty good. But God demands our very best. He wants us to give Him our very best. And it can be easy to fall into a rut, both individually and as a church. It can be easy to accept less than the best. It can be easy to fall into the traps of bad practices that Satan tempts us with. But you know, some of those traps can be very deadly. Today, as I said, I'm resuming our look at the book of Ezra, restoring hope. And we're going to see some great examples of God's people doing what God wanted them to do when they're called on to do something different. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for them. They had setbacks, but ultimately they got back on track. And they got back on track for the task that God had given them, which was to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, we won't be getting that far along. We're not going to see where they rebuilt the temple. We're not going to get that far today. But in today's text, we're going to see some very timeless principles that can and should apply here at Mackville, should apply in your everyday lives. Because I'm going to tell you, never underestimate what you can learn from the Old Testament Jews. Never underestimate them. There's some great stories of the faith there. You know, they were different. Theologically, they were under the old covenant, or they lived before Jesus' death and His resurrection. We today live, of course, after Jesus' death and resurrection. So that's different. But I think there's some very distinct parallels between us and the Jews of the Old Testament. And we need to understand that. We need to see those parallels that God's people, anytime that you want to draw a parallel between God's people and the Old Testament, it's easy to do. We can see great stories there. And it starts with the church. It starts with God's chosen people today, the Christians who are God's blood-bought people. And that's what we're talking about today. We need to sometimes recharge. Recharge ourselves. And I believe that you can recharge. You can recharge the church when you fully rely on God. And we're going to see that in Ezra 4 and 5 today. That's what the Jews did. They were told to rebuild the temple, and they used some very basic, timeless principles. They resisted compromise. They responded biblically, and they renewed their faith and their commitment to God's task. So the first thing I want you to think about this morning is to resist compromise. Resist compromising God's Word. Resist compromise. I want you to follow along with me in Ezra chapter 4 as we pick up on Judah's rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra chapter 4, starting there in verse 1. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, Let us build with you, for we worship God, worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to Him ever since the day of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus the king of Persia has commanded us. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all the days of Cyrus king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Oh boy. When we pick up here today, Ezra chapter 4 and verse 1, everything seems to be going all hunky-dory, doesn't it? I mean, everything seemed to be fine with those people. But if you have an English Standard Version, which is what I read from, has a little heading over that. And it says, adversaries oppose the rebuilding. If you have a New International Version, the one I consulted, it says, opposition to the rebuilding. And I looked at a King James Version, and the little heading said, the work is hindered. But you know something? The greeting committee to Zerubbabel and Joshua and all the Israelite leaders, the welcome committee didn't want them to know that. They didn't want them to know that they were out to hinder them. They came to these guys maybe like a welcome wagon. Does the welcome wagon even exist anymore? I don't even know. But they came to see me once. I had moved. Somebody knocked on my door. And there stood this lady out there, and she had this big basket of stuff. And in it, there were all kinds of coupons, discounts, gifts. I don't even know what all was in that stuff. But basically what she was saying to me, and she was giving to that, was, welcome to this community. We're here to help you. Some of you may have experienced that in the past. I don't even know if that exists anymore, but that's what happened. She was saying, we're here to help you. We're here to help. But those guys, when they approached the returning exiles, we're not giving their names. They approached the returning exiles who were led by men named Zerubbabel and Jeshua. They were trying to say, we're here to help you. But obviously from your heading, they were lying. They were lying, or at least they didn't realize how bad off they were. They were saying, we're here to help you. But they didn't mean it. They didn't mean it at all. Ezra made it clear that these guys were the enemy. They were the wolves in sheep's clothing. And we face them all the time. They were there for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to deceive. They were there to deceive the Israelites. They were there to deceive the people returning from Babylon. They were there to deceive them. God's people were accomplishing something. And you can bet that when God's people are accomplishing something, Satan's going to rise up someone, somewhere, to try to shut them down. You can be assured of that's going to happen. You know, there's something about history. History is often an example to us. And we're seeing an example here of how Satan is trying to thwart God's purposes. Look at what Paul said about Old Testament history. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, he says, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. You see, history teaches us about the works and the nature of our eternal God. We learn about God there. But you know what else we learn from history? We learn about the works and the nature of God's opponent, Satan. We know that. We see how God works as well. So it's foolish to ignore that. The opposition here was the Samaritans. And we know that those people were absolutely hated by the Jews. You see, when the northern kingdom of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians in 722 or 721 BC, The Assyrians took many people and they tried to integrate them into their own society and teach them their own religions and things like that, their own culture, and they wanted to discourage revolt. And the Assyrians would be shuffling people all around. You can read a lot about that in 1 Kings, especially in 1 Kings 17. I won't go into all that today. It talks a little bit about that. But there were intermarriages between the Israelites and the heathens. And a lot of years I've heard good Christian people say, well, that means we should not have interracial marriages in our society today. But that's taking the wrong interpretation. Because why did God forbid interracial marriage then? It was because of religion. It was because he didn't want to corrupt their faith. And the point was to keep religion pure by not marrying unbelievers. That kind of thing had infiltrated Israel and further corrupted their religion. And the Samaritans had intermarried so much, but they also had a political motive here. They said, let us help you. We want to help you build. We're worshiping the same gods you do. Same God you do. For whatever reason, these Samaritans had developed a religion that John MacArthur said was a superstitious form of worshiping God. They said, we want to help you. But really what they were trying to do was to deceive. Zerubbabel and the other leaders called them on their lie. Look at what they said in verse 3 again. Ezra chapter 4 and verse 3. But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the father's house in Israel said to them, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. There was a simple reason for this. They were saying, you're going to compromise God's word. We're not going to compromise God's word. We're not going to compromise our faith at all. We're not going to compromise. We're resisting that temptation to compromise. They knew they had a mission to carry out. It was God's mission, and God had used Cyrus, the king of Persia, to release these Jews, to release them to go back to Jerusalem from their captivity in Babylon. And he had released them to get it done. It was really a spiritual mission, because what was the mission? It was to rebuild the temple. And what was the temple? It was the symbol of their faith in God. It was one of those symbols. It was all a spiritual warfare. And Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the leaders of Israel, or the Jewish people, said, we aren't going to compromise. We have nothing to do with you. You have nothing to do with us in the building of something for our God. You see, the lesson was, don't compromise your faith. It can sometimes be easy to look at maybe some shortcuts and compromise. Satan wants you to think that. We see it all the time. The lesson here in Ezra is to resist that compromise. Resist compromising your faith. Well, the second thing is to respond biblically. You know, when people oppose you and try to get you off the right road, it can be easy to come back with some quick and sarcastic retort, isn't it? Some people say that I'm the king of that. I don't know if that's a thing I should be proud of or not, but I've been known to say some things because I wanted to put somebody in their place, and I regret it. I regret it. But I do kind of chuckle at this story from World War II. The war in Europe was winding down early in March of 1945. But at that time, there were still about 2 months until Germany surrendered. And there were still enough German armies out there and enough soldiers that they were still causing some trouble. And General George Patton, who was known for moving pretty fast and doing things that others couldn't do or wouldn't do, had just taken the German city of Trier, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. He had just taken that city, and he got a message from General Eisenhower, who was his commander. And General Eisenhower's office said, bypass Trier, because it's going to take 4 divisions to take this town. Well, remember, General Patton had just taken it with 2 divisions, and so he wrote a reply back. He said, I've taken Trier with 2 divisions. What do you want me to do? Give it back? And you think about that. Sometimes we give answers like that. And sometimes they have their place. But as we talked about in my Sunday school class this morning, when you call somebody out, respond biblically. Respond with love. Respond biblically. Like I said, I've been known to make some sarcastic remarks. But now that I'm older and hopefully wiser, it's not a designation I'm very proud of. But when you read Ezra chapter 4, you see that the motivation is the key. Look at verse 3. You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. Why would Zerubbabel, why would Joshua and the other Jewish leaders say that? Obviously, as I've already said, we know they weren't compromising. But they also knew that because of a biblical principle. They also knew what had happened biblically. They knew what had happened in the history of the Jewish people. You see, back in verse 2, the opposition claimed they had been making sacrifices to the God of Judah for about 150 years. They said they'd been doing that since the days of Ezra. And that was about 150 years before this account comes up. But as we mentioned before, they'd intermarried. And the religion was far from what God wanted. And the Jewish leaders, Zerubbabel and Jeshua, were calling them out on it. And they knew these guys were saying, we want to help you. But they knew these guys were not of the Lord. And so they responded biblically. Now, Ezra doesn't go into a lot of detail other than to say, they said, you have nothing to do with us. But responding biblically, we have the greatest example of all to do that. Jesus himself. Think about what Jesus did in his own life, early in his ministry. After he was baptized, he went into the wilderness, and Satan tried to tempt him. Satan said, turn these stones in front of you to bread. And what did Jesus do? He said, it is written. It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. That's Matthew chapter 4 and verse 4. Jesus was quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 3. But then Satan tried to get a little crafty with Jesus. And he said, throw yourself down in front of off the temple. Throw yourself down from the temple. And the angels will catch you. And what Satan was doing was, he was taking something that was written in Psalm 91, verses 11 and 12, and twisting it. He was twisting it for his own benefit. But what did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? Look at what Matthew said in Matthew 4:7. Jesus said to him, again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And Jesus was quoting Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 12. But then Satan tempted him again. And he said, look at all the kingdoms of the world. Look at all this. He said, you bow down and worship me, and I'll give it all to you. And what did Jesus do? Matthew 4:10. Then Jesus said to him, be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Jesus was referencing Deuteronomy 6:13 and 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 3. You see, I believe that when Satan's trying to pull you down, when he's trying to infiltrate your faith, trying to get you down, we need to respond biblically. It can be through Bible verses, as Jesus did, with the concepts sometimes. And we find Jesus doing that at times as well. Or it can be like what Joshua and Zerubbabel did. You have nothing to do with me. But respond biblically. Yes, love people, but respond biblically and stand your ground. Responding biblically is what we should do. But we need to take advantage of it. If we're going to do that, we need to take advantage of opportunities to learn what Scriptures. And it really concerns me when I see so many people today that don't see the need to study God's Word in depth. You know, for example, we've been having some great times in our Sunday school class, especially over the last 6 or 8 weeks. We had some great discussions on some Sundays. But we miss you. We miss you. There's times we've tried to get some other things going, and they seem to start well, but too many times people allow schedules or say, well, I've become too busy. Folks, we need to commit to learning. I understand. I mean, I'm busy. All of us are busy. And sometimes we can't work things out. But commit to learning. Commit to learning. You know, we offer video, and that's good, but it's still not the same as being able to go and ask questions. And how can I apply this? And you know, I'm here to help you as well. I'm not like those guys, though, saying we're here to help and deceive you. I honestly mean it. I want to help you. If you have questions about how something applies to your life, don't be afraid to ask. But also, practice responding biblically. Know the Word so well that you can always respond in tough situations. That's what we've got to strive for. To be able to automatically know what the Word says. Stand for the truth, but do so in love. Because that's what responding biblically is. Well, the final thing I see from Ezra chapter 4, or this one is actually Ezra chapter 5, is to renew your commitment to God's task. Now, we're going to skip the rest of Ezra chapter 4. I'm just going to summarize a little bit what's going on here. It seems like it's kind of a parenthetical reference, the rest of chapter 4. And it's inserted right here to highlight this theme. It talks about various opposition to the Jews when they were building in Jerusalem. And it seems to indicate some of the things that were going on when Nehemiah, who we studied a few months ago, when Nehemiah was leading the rebuilding of the walls around Jerusalem. But the opposition became so intense that there was a 16-year hiatus in rebuilding the temple. They had to stop. They had to stop. And it took 16 years for it to get started again. Now, folks, sometimes that happens. I've been there. I've been there. When there's a major project going on, you know something? There's always going to be a snag. Satan's always going to throw something out there. Something always happens. But folks, I've never endured a 16-year delay. 16 years. But during that time, there was a new king in Persia. His name was Darius. Cyrus had died in 530 BC. And there have been several kings until Darius took over in 521. Now we're around 520. And that's where we pick up in Ezra chapter 5 and verse 1. Now the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Jerusalem, or in Judah and Jerusalem, in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, arose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. At the same time, Tatnai, the governor of the province of beyond the river, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus: Who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish this structure? They also asked, What are the names of the men who are on the building this building? But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until the report should reach Darius, and then an answer be returned by letter concerning it. There's some major points here. Verse 1 says that the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah prodded the people to build the temple, rebuild it. We need to understand something. When we talk about prophecy, it's not just telling the future. Prophecy is telling a message from God. And Haggai and Zechariah both wrote books in the Old Testament. They reflected the character of God. And they spoke God's name. And that meant more than just saying his name. The name meant reflecting the character. We talked about that, if you remember, in that series that we did early in the year about praying extreme prayers in the name. It reflects the character of God. But then the opposition asked, who said you could build this? And who's doing this? And verse 5 is so significant, though. Read that with me again. Verse 5, man, it just speaks to us today. But the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until the report should reach Darius, and then an answer be returned by letter concerning it. It was God's power that made this happen. It's God's power. He was over everything. And the people were determined to follow his will. So when Tatnai was governor, he allowed that work to go on until he heard from the king. Wow. People were opposing him, but the government allowed him to go on because they said, we've got this from the king. You know, I believe God worked then, and I believe that he has worked in the history of Mackville Christian Church as well. You know, I can't emphasize how big a day I think we have coming up here. Because 200 years, very few churches today meet that. It's not that many. And I've been amazed at some of the things I found. A couple of weeks ago, Justin Hatchett and I visited the site of the original church building. It's just off Texas Road. And it was built in, the actual church building was actually built in 1827. The church started meeting in 1826 in someone's house. You're going to have a whole history available in a couple of weeks. But you have to remember that when that church building was built, this was frontier. This was frontier area. I was curious, and I wanted to look up what the population of Washington County was in 1820 and 1830 with the census. Well, the 1820 census, the population of Washington County was 15,947, and in 1830 it was 19,017. Both of them were more populous than today. But there's a couple of things that happened that skewed that. 1827, a large part of Washington County was taken to form Anderson County. And in 1834, a large portion of Washington County was taken to form Marion County. So it's kind of different. It's not exactly the same. But both of those numbers are larger than today. But the key is that 7 people got together to form what we know as Long-Wick Christian Church. And they believed it was important to have a place to meet. Like I said, they met at a home for a while, but then they built this small building. I believe that's it. That's a picture of it. Thank you, Sandy Carey. He sent me a book, and it's got some pictures in it. That's a picture of the original building. That's a picture of the original building of Long-Wick Christian Church. Now, it's not there anymore. And there's only a few items that would ever indicate there was a building there. But you're a part of that legacy that started in that building right there. Do you realize that? You're a part of that legacy. We're trying to find out some info, as I told my Sunday school class this morning, that the building that was built on this spot in 1860 and then later torn down to make room for this building, 1860 was just before the Civil War. And the county was in turmoil. I'm sure there was probably some issues about the Civil War around Mackville. But the reason I'm bringing all that up is it's endured. This church has endured. This church has endured, and this church has followed God's will. And I bring these things up to remind you that Mackville Christian Church didn't just happen. 7 people risked a lot back in 1826. And I'm sure there was times that there was turmoil, maybe even there in the church during the Civil War. Yet the church endured because of commitment. And eventually there was a thriving church, and I believe this was probably the first service in this building. That picture's from 1905. 1905. Look what had happened there. Folks, I would love to have that here every Sunday, would you? Look at that. Look at that. So many people. I have no idea there how many was there. But it was a thriving church. It was because people endured. Sometimes they needed to recharge. Sometimes they needed to renew. We know that. But they didn't compromise. They didn't compromise God's word. And we can be thankful for that. Folks, we can recharge and we must recharge. We do it by resisting compromise, by responding biblically, and by renewing your commitment to God's task. I pray every one of you will do that. Every one of you will do that every day of your life. Let's go to the Lord in prayer as we close.